This is Keith Helwig from Cops Corrections Videos. If you like my videos, please hit the red subscribe button and we'll be friends forever. I'd like to talk today about complacency. I've made videos in the past about complacency and how complacency can be a killer. And I want to discuss complacency in a specific area, that being in a correctional setting of officers failing to make rounds. No matter what post you work, whether it's a perimeter post, whether it's a cell block, whether it's a dining hall, whether it's a school facility, whatever, you are required to make rounds. Now, it varies from state to state, it varies from facility to facility. I know the institutions I worked at when I was an officer and a sergeant, you had to make a round at least every 30 minutes. Now, that didn't mean you made it at 10, you made it at 10:30, you made it at 11. That meant you made it at 10:07, you made another one at 10:25. You varied your rounds to keep people on their toes. I've seen too many people become complacent about their rounds and their responsibilities when they're making their rounds. In fact, if one were to look at the past history of major disturbances in correctional facilities, a lot of it has to do with complacency by the officers. Now, I'm not saying the officers caused the riots by their complacency, but the riots were allowed to expand because of the officers' complacency. Now, before people get their undies in a bundle and think I'm blaming the officers for the riots, I'm not. But it was complacency that led to the spread of the riot in the New Mexico State Prison years ago when officers on third shift decided to prop a door open rather than lock it. Had they locked that door, that disturbance would not have been able to proceed through that facility. In Ohio, one of the longest hostage situations in prison history in the United States played out because of officer complacency. Two inmates that worked in the kitchen, who happened to be lifers, watched the routine every day as an officer left the kitchen, went to the bottom of the sally port by the tower, and was led into the tower to deliver the meal. Well, the policy and the procedure called for the officer inside of the tower, there were two officers, called for one of the officers inside of the tower to identify the officer that was coming into the tower, make sure it was an officer, and all that kind of stuff before they let him in. Well, these inmates watched it long enough and they knew that that officer was not following procedure. So they took over the officer that was working in the kitchen. They took his uniform. One of these murderers, convicted murderers, went to the base of the tower in an officer's uniform, and the officer in the tower did not check to make sure that he was in fact an officer, and he allowed him into the tower. Well, he in turn allowed his friend into the tower, and I believe it was for 13 days. They terrorized a female officer that they had hostage. They'd raped her. They beat the male officer. They eventually let him go. But it was officer complacency that allowed them to get into the tower. Had the officer followed procedures and not become complacent, just looked down and thought, well, that's another CO coming in. I'm just going to pop him in, no need to check IDs. That would not have happened. In my own career, I've seen complacency in action. I recall a specific incident of a sergeant who made a round at the beginning of their shift and at 10 o'clock at night, and at 5:45 in the morning found an inmate dead in his cell. Well, by the time they alerted everybody, rigor mortis had already set in. So that individual had been dead for quite a while, so it was apparent that that officer was not making their rounds every half hour as they were supposed to. Now, myself and another captain were assigned to investigate this, and at that time, because of the union contract, we couldn't use cameras in the facility for disciplinary purposes, but we discovered that the officer in charge made a round when he came on at approximately 10:15 and went and sat in the sergeant's booth, and his sergeant, who I hold equally culpable in this situation, they sat in that booth until 5:45 in the morning when he made his second round. Now, unfortunately, we couldn't do anything because of the union contract at that time. However, the officer did transfer to another shift and to another position. Another situation which just occurred recently. Once again, the officer made a round at the start of his shift on third shift. And everybody knows third shift is about as interesting as watching dry paint turn yellow in most institutions. Inmates are locked down. He was working in a secured unit. Inmates were locked down, made a round at the beginning of his shift, made a round at the end of his shift, And in the meantime, an inmate had suffered a medical emergency and had basically bled out. Now, he didn't bleed out because he committed suicide. He bled out because he had a stoma, and the stoma came loose, and he bled out. Well, once again, given the time frame, they knew that the officer had not made his rounds, and he ended up losing his job over it. Things have changed over the years. I personally had to terminate 2 deputies when I was a lieutenant for a sheriff's department that worked in a juvenile facility, who for over a week were making 1 round a shift. Well, when it came to light that they weren't following the procedure and the law, they ended up losing their job. So complacency is something that's easy to fall into. It's something that's easy to break. How long does it take you to really make a round of your unit, particularly on 3rd shift? There's no movement, there's nothing going on. Make your rounds. Don't be complacent. Don't let complacency kill an inmate. Don't let complacency kill your job. Until next time, this is Keith Helwig from Cops Corrections Videos. Stay safe and watch your back.